All right, U.S. history students, it's me, Mr. Shear. Not back with you yet, obviously, but I hope to be back really soon. So just maybe one or two more lessons just like this. If you're following along in class today, there's a note sheet that's going to go along with this, and the speed note sheet is a little bit different than the ones that we've done before. It's going to ask you in some places to kind of draw a diagram, or it really requires that you just listen to what's going on. So if you need the person that's conducting the lesson, or the substitute, or whoever's in the classroom, if you need them to pause the video as you fill some things in, please let them know so that you can fill in that part of the review sheet. It's not necessary that you speed through everything. There's plenty of time to be able to write your notes on the sheet if you need to. So as you're following along, please listen carefully, because not everything is actually going to show up on the screen like you might normally expect to see it. So I'm going to share out the PowerPoint screen with you. Again, just follow along in your notes as you go along here. Okay, we are introducing the 1920s, and there's a little bit of lag here. Okay, we're going to talk about the next era, the 1920s, and now that that World War I is over, what happens with life? The 20s are a crazy time because World War I just blew people's minds, and trying to adjust to life after that was very, very difficult for a lot of people. And so the 20s is a decade when people are trying to figure things out, trying to find themselves, trying to piece their lives back together again. And because of that, you see people that are looking for answers in all different ways and in all different places. And so you get some really interesting things that happen in the 20s because people just don't quite know exactly how to piece life back together after the war. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second here. So one other thing that is occurring at the end of the war. So like the war is bad, right? And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But right at the tail end of the war, the world experiences something very similar to what we're experiencing right now, which is kind of crazy given the context of everything that's going on in the world today. During the latter parts of 1918 and through 1919, the world experienced a pandemic, a flu pandemic, and it was started by, came from an H1N1 virus, and where it started, they don't know. It might have been spread by birds or whatever, but there's this massive flu pandemic. And you guys know firsthand kind of what it's like sort of living through one of these experiences. And we keep saying, people say this all the time, this has never happened before. We've never experienced this before. And while some of that might be true, this has kind of happened before. And this flu pandemic, the 1918, there's a lot of similarities between that and what we're experiencing now. 1/3 of the world's population, they believe, became infected. So you talk about the reach of a pandemic and how many people or how many individuals it affects. 1/3 of the population became infected at one point or another, they believe. For a total, about 50 million deaths occurred worldwide and about 700,000 in the US. So, I mean, it was devastating. You say, well, it's the flu, right? Not a big deal. It's the flu. Well, there are obviously lots of different strains of the flu, and this particular one was obviously very deadly. So what they had on their hands in this situation was very, very similar to what we're working with now. There was no vaccine. There was no antibiotic treatment or anything else like that they could do. And so people were just kind of stuck in the same situation. So what did they do? Well, you can kind of see on the left there. They recommended wearing masks, recommended personal hygiene, hand washing, and stuff like that, because when something like this occurs and there's no vaccine or there's no antibiotic, that's what the best that we can do. And so here we are, that we had a World War I, which for the United States wasn't nearly as bad as it was for many of the European countries, but anybody that participated in it or saw any of it or even had any shred of an idea of what World War I was, it was devastating and ugly. And then on the heels of that, you've got this worldwide pandemic, kind of like we're experiencing now, and saying, and where people are like, oh man, this is terrible. This is, 2020 is such a horrible year. Nothing's ever been like this. Well, they're dealing with the same thing then, right on the heels of a gigantic world war. So if you think it's, the current situation, 2020 has been a really bad year, imagine the same kind of thing happening 100 years previous, right on the heels of World War One. So I just thought this was really interesting and really important for us to bring up today, because a lot of times people don't realize that this actually happened in history, and here we are experiencing something like this now and don't even realize that the United States has been through something like this before. And we do come out on the other side of it, and everything is okay in the end. And so much so that probably 100 years later, most of you didn't even know that this happened. And so hopefully that's the case with what we're experiencing now someday. But as far as the people of the 1920s, this is something that they also had to deal with. Add that to the fact of what was going on after World War One. We've talked about this before. World War One was crazy because it was sort of like old war meets new war. Technology had changed, and technology to kill and destroy had increased almost faster than the technology to protect and preserve. And because of that, World War One was flat out devastating and ugly. Not nearly as bad for us in the United States as it was for some other people. I'm going to follow this link if it works here and show you some things. Is it going to work for us? We'll see if it'll bring it up. I'm going to make sure you can see this. I wasn't sure if it pulled up for you. Here we go. So this lists casualties of World War One. As you look at this chart, it's got it divided between our allied powers and our central powers, and it kind of totals them up as well. And you can see grand totals and everything else like that. But as you look across this chart, look for some patterns. What do you notice? What do you see? If we're in a situation in the classroom right now where you can pause it and we can look at that and you can get a chance to look at the data, go ahead and do that and see what sticks out to you. What has the biggest impact, or what countries does this impact the most? I think one of the things, if you're following along, you can kind of tell that the United States doesn't suffer nearly as much as some of these other countries that are involved in the war. Remember, part of the reason is because the United States doesn't join the war until much later. And so because of that, they obviously don't lose as many lives. They're not spending as much time on the war front, and as a result, the casualties are a lot less. So but even still, when we talk about total casualties, there's still about 300,000 casualties of war. That's about 7% of the U.S. forces. That's not too bad. But if you look at the other allies on our side, and you look at some of these numbers, when we talk about Italy, who wasn't in the war all the time, they kind of switched sides a little bit, 2 million casualties. France, 6 million casualties. Great Britain, 3 million casualties. And then, of course, Russia, who again wasn't in the war the whole time, 9 million casualties. And those 9 million casualties represented 76% of their military. That's phenomenal and unbelievable. As far as we're talking about the entire Allied side, we're talking about 22 million casualties, or 50% of all armed forces. Then you look at the Central Power side and you see some similarly staggering numbers. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, both, again, about 7 million casualties apiece. That's 90% of the Austro-Hungarian forces, and we talked a little bit about how devastated they were after the war. For Germany, 65%. So we end up with a grand total of 37 million casualties from World War One. 37 million, or 57% of all people that were in the armed forces for this war. 37 million. That's a huge imprint on the world population. And this kind of devastation, this kind of tragedy, things are not going to be the same. Certainly, it's something that may not have as big of an impact on the U.S. as maybe some other countries that are absolutely just completely torn to pieces. But even so, for the United States, even if you're not one of those 323,000 casualties, you may be the guy that was standing beside one of those 323,000 casualties. You may have been the guy that was right next to him in the trenches when a mortar cannon just ripped through somebody. And then you have to go home and go back to life and be like, okay, all right, back to normal. Right? We talk a lot nowadays about post-traumatic stress disorder and the impact that it has for people that serve in the military and come back to life, and how difficult it is to make that adjustment. We at least are somewhat aware of that today, and we have treatments for PTSD and try to help the soldiers that experience that. But in World War I, it was new. It was not something that we had really been exposed to that much before. And so we're just taking these millions of soldiers, some of which experienced some really difficult things, and throwing them back into society in the 1920s and said, well, okay, war's over, good luck. Oh yeah, by the way, there's a flu pandemic too, and everybody's dying for that. So this is the reality of the 1920s. They have experienced this and a flu pandemic, and now shake that all up and throw it back into the 1920s and say, just live your life. It's unbelievable to try to think about how somebody would adjust to that. So there's got some money figures of the cost of the war as well, but we're not going to get into that right now. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. This just kind of gives you an idea of, there we go. See if that works. All right. Just kind of gives you an idea of what people are coming back to and why the 1920s is so weird, because it's weird for everyone. They just don't know how to deal with this, and understandably so, because they've experienced something that people had never really experienced up to this point and didn't know how to deal with it. So in many cases, the 1920s are referred to as the lost generation, because they really were. And if you've read, and I don't know if you guys are quite there yet in your English classes, I think eventually, if you haven't started already, you're going to read The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is going to fit in with his theme a lot. It's about people in the 1920s trying to make sense of life that doesn't seem to have much meaning anymore. And for this reason, people of the 1920s, particularly those that are veterans that came back from the war, are referred to as this lost generation, because they literally felt lost in their own lives. What they used to know was not there anymore, and so they're referred to in that way. For many of them, the answer is to try to get back to normal. When we experience tragedies, isn't that the way that we kind of think of things a lot? We're like, hey, if I could just go back to the way things were before all this happened, everything would be so much better. And for those, if you've experienced tragedy in your life before, isn't that often the response that we have? I just want things to get back to normal. I don't want this reality anymore. I want the old reality. And that's how a lot of people tried to cope in the 1920s. They tried to get back to what was normal. They tried to say, okay, let's almost like pretending none of this ever happened and just try to reset and get things back to the way that they were. And so a lot of the 1920s is trying to get back to normal. So there's a couple ways in which they try to do this. First off, a lot of the nations of the world sign an agreement called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It has nothing to do with cereal. It was somebody's name. So Kellogg-Briand Pact was an agreement between several countries, 15 countries to be exact, that they were not going to go to war again. So they signed this paper like, hey, we don't want to ever do this again, so we're going to sign this pact, and we agree never to go to war again. Now, this sounds really good. For many people, this feels right, and it feels like a good thing, and it makes people feel like they won't experience this again, and that's kind of return to normal. But at the same time, how realistic is something like this? An agreement that countries are going to say, well, hey, well, we promise not to go to war again. Well, that sounds nice and it feels good, but how do you actually make that happen? And let's say somebody does start a war with somebody else. What do? How do you punish the country that has broken the Kellogg-Briand Pact? Do you go to war with them? because then you break the pact too. I mean, there's no way to enforce this whatsoever. So it's more of a feel-good kind of thing where everybody's like, yeah, we're not going to go to war again, and it makes people feel good about it. But in reality, that's all that it is, and it can't actually really produce any sort of results, because we've seen history repeats itself very soon thereafter with World War II. So it's very, very difficult to actually follow through with this. But again, people just want to feel good, and that sort of helps them feel better about everything. Another big open wound from World War I is the massive amount of debt. And so I showed you kind of the bottom part of that chart real quickly there when we were looking at it. It showed the massive cost of World War I. One of the big parts of the Treaty of Versailles that we discussed earlier is that Germany is having to pay these massive war reparations, which they could never pay because, they lost. So they don't have any money to pay. And so that means if Germany can't pay, France and Great Britain aren't getting paid. If France and Great Britain don't have any money, they can't pay us back for all the money that we loaned them during the war. And so nobody's getting paid. And as long as there's massive war debts, things can't really go back to being normal, and there can be no real recovery because there's debt to be paid. So a man comes up with this idea to help get the juices flowing here, so to speak, to get the wheels turning and things moving as far as the debt repayment. It's called the Dawes Plan. Now, here's the idea. I'm going to follow this with me. It may not seem to make much sense, but it kind of does. So Germany owed all the money, right? So Germany can't pay back anything because they don't have any money. So what happens is the United States, a bunch of private banks and private investors, they say, okay, we will loan you, Germany, the money. And so they begin issuing loans to Germany. So Germany gets some of that money on loan from the United States. Now, I realize they're already in massive debt because they're trying to pay this back, but that's okay. So the United States is going to loan them money. Germany then will begin to repay the debts that they owe Great Britain and France. Okay, and then Great Britain and France will begin to pay back the United States. I think I have this on another slide. Oh, maybe not. Okay, so in this whole scheme of things, if you think about this, the United States pays back, offers loans to Germany. Germany pays back their loans to Great Britain and France. France and Great Britain pay back their loans to the United States, and everybody's getting things paid back. Now, logically, the United States is kind of getting paid back with its own money, right? It's going in a triangle and it's just kind of recycling money. In actuality, does this work? Not really. Economics are complicated. And I know that it seems like this is really, really silly, but in some ways this does work, because what's happening is debts are being paid. Most of the time what we do in society is we recycle debts. People pay off debts with other debts and just pay off the first part of the debt in kind of a cycle way. And so this happens a lot. Does it really bring anybody out of debt permanently? No, Germany's still very much in debt, but the wheels debts are being paid off, and the wheels are turning, and people can look at this and be like, hey, yeah, debts are being paid off. Now, are we really making a whole lot of progress? Probably not, but it looks like things are going, and feels like debts are being paid off. And so people can look at this and they can say, oh, good, yeah, all right, we're getting past the war because debts are being paid off. So to some degree, it gets the economic wheels turning after World War I. Finally, the world proposes massive arms reductions. And this was something that Woodrow Wilson had pushed for during his Treaty of Versailles negotiations. That didn't really happen right off the bat, but it begins to happen throughout the world. Remember how everybody had built up these gigantic militaries prior to the war? Well, now they're saying, now that kind of leads us to do things that we probably shouldn't do. So let's keep those armies small, then we won't be tempted to use them. And so they begin reducing armaments, militaries, and all those things throughout the world. As for the United States at home, they bring in a president who promises to bring things back to normal. His name is Warden G. Harding, and he calls for a return to normalcy. Now, it doesn't matter that normalcy really isn't a word. He's a president, so he kind of grants it. So in this, his promise to return to normalcy, that rings true with a lot of Americans. They're like, yeah, let's get back to normal. And that's what he hopes to bring. Unfortunately, President Harding struggles very much doing so because he's surrounded by some guys that work with him that are not that great. The president brings in his cabinet with him. And this particular cabinet, it has a negative nickname. They're called the Ohio Gang. He was from Ohio, and he brought some of his cronies and people along with him. And the people that he chooses to put in his cabinet are not really good, upstanding people. They lie, steal, cheat, bribe, all those kinds of things that you don't really want to be associated with you if you're the president of the United States. Now, as for Warren G. Harding, is he a bad dude? Well, probably not nearly as much as the people that he chooses to put around him in his cabinet. So he's kind of guilty by association, because if you're the president and the people that you put in your cabinet start lying, cheating, stealing, and bribing, then it's probably not going to reflect very well on you. And that's the problem that Warren G. Harding had as he was president of the United States. The most famous of these scandals that takes place is called the Teapot Dome scandal. And just really quickly, basically what happens is his Secretary of the Interior, a guy by the name of Albert Fall, leases out some oil-rich lands, a place called the Teapot Dome, to private oil companies, which the oil was set aside for the U.S. military and everything else like that. But technically, you could lease out the land for the government. The problem was that Albert Fall, since he leased out this oil on very favorable terms, the oil company's like, hey, thanks a lot, Albert. Here's some gifts and money and things like that. That part, which we call kickbacks, is very illegal, and you can't really do that. So Albert Fall all of a sudden kind of like starts living this lavish life of privilege and luxury, and people are like, wow, Albert, man, I didn't think you really made that much money. Like, where'd you get all your money? And people start kind of trying to follow the trail of the money, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, so it looks like he just sort of illegally took this from oil companies. And people find out about this, and it blows up, and people are like, oh, this is crazy, because certainly it wasn't the first incident that Harding's cabinet had during his presidency. And so that corruption and that evidence of the corruption just kind of really spoils people the wrong way, and they begin to question the office of the presidency, and they question, wow, maybe the president isn't always the most upstanding human being. I know this is a really radical concept for 2020, but they really question the character of the president, which up to this point they had normally just kind of given the president the benefit of the doubt most of the time. So Warren G. Harding's presidency is cut short. He dies while in office. And as a result, his vice president will become president. And his vice president is an interesting dude by the name of Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was known as Silent Cal because he didn't like to talk. If you don't like to talk, president of the United States is probably not the job for you. But nevertheless, he was kind of thrust into it and sort of had to deal with what the situation as it kind of came up. He is an interesting dude, to say the least. He had so many animals at the White House: raccoons, ferrets. He had a pygmy hippo. I don't think they actually kept that at the White House. Lots of dogs, birds, just like a menagerie of animals, which is kind of really interesting. I guess it's cool. Calvin Coolidge also had one of the strangest things ever installed in the White House. It's called a mechanical horse. Think like like the little things at the supermarket that you put the quarters in, little kids put the quarters in, and they kind of like bob up and down. It's kind of like a mechanical horse. It's sort of like I don't know, like a horse treadmill maybe. I don't know. But anyway, it was very interesting. That's how he got his exercise. He rode the mechanical horse in the White House. So that's odd. He also slept like all the time. Dude slept like 10 hours a night, and then insisted on every day having a 2-hour nap in the middle of the afternoon, which is like the president of the United States. Like maybe you should be awake more often than you're asleep, but with Calvin Coolidge, that was not necessarily the case. Finally, I said he didn't like to talk, and one of his most famous incidents for Calvin Coolidge was he had this, there was this lady that was going to a party that the president was going to be at, and she was very, very excited. And of course, Calvin Coolidge had a reputation for not being very talkative, and so she was getting ready for the party, and she was telling her husband, she's like, yeah, I can't wait. I'm going to go. I'm going to talk to the president, man. I'm going to get him to talk and talk and talk and talk. And her husband's like, there's no way you're going to get this guy to talk. He doesn't talk to anybody. He's like, and she's like, he's like, I bet you're not going to be able to get him to talk. And she goes, "Oh, I'll bet you he said, "You probably can't get him to say more than 3 words all night." And she says, "I'll take that bet." And so she goes to the party and she's mingling around, and the president comes in. She's like, "Oh, here's my chance." So she goes over to talk to Calvin Coolidge. She's like, Mr. President, so glad to talk to you. Grateful to be able to meet you. Couldn't wait to. I bet my husband tonight that I couldn't get you to say 3 words all night, and just so excited to talk to you." And he looks her straight in the eye and he goes, "You lose," and then walks away. So that was the kind of stunning personality that Calvin Coolidge was. But for the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge was kind of the shot in the arm that they needed, because dude was all about big business. And if there was anything that ever took Americans' minds off of how crappy World War I was and life was and everything else like that, it was going back to the way things were before, and that was big business and industry and making stuff and buying stuff. And Calvin Coolidge was all about that. So he removes a lot of government barriers to businesses to allow them to operate freely and to accumulate massive amounts of money like they always love to do. Okay, so among the biggest businesses of the time was the automobile. Henry Ford is popping those Model Ts off the production line about as fast as you can. By the time we get to the end of the 1920s, we got the Model A's coming out. It's all the rage. And because of the automobile, so many other industries were impacted. So you've got, it's not just about the automobile. It's about the materials that go into the automobile, the rubber, the glass, the steel, all of those kinds of things. It's just, when you have an automobile, now you need gas stations, now you need roads, now you need hotels because people travel. You need auto parts stores, you need service stations, you have drive-in movies and drive-in restaurants, and all of these things that can start to pop up, and all these industries that can develop because of the automobile. So it has a huge impact on society and business, and creates a great influx of commerce in the economy. Also, during the time, you got the popularization of radio and entertainment, and it becomes kind of one of those things where everybody has a radio in their house. Every single person is connected into the news, and that through the radio, and it becomes a means for music entertainment. And they had, like we watch TV shows, they had shows like that on the radio, and people would just tune in and listen and sit in front of the radio each night at a certain time and listen to these programs, and it becomes just this huge opportunity for entertainment and for business and for advertising and for all of these new things. And all of this is because the emphasis that Calvin Coolidge puts on business and commerce. So in one way, Calvin Coolidge was probably not the best candidate ever for the presidency, but in the 1920s, it sort of worked out because of his emphasis on big business. Also with this is the extension of something called credit. You know what credit is because of credit cards and things like this. Credit worked a little bit different in the 1920s. They had what they call buying on credit. So what would happen is you go into a store and you say, "I want to buy this couch," and they'd say, "Okay, it's $500." You're like, "I don't have $500." They're like, "Okay, well, you can pay the store in installment loans. You can pay $100 a month for 5 months until you can pay it off." And so that's how it worked, buying on credit. The store, instead of there being a credit card, a middleman, a bank in the middle, the stores took on the credit. And so stores started allowing people to buy things on credit all over the place so that they can buy all these goods. It creates a lot of consumerism. It also creates a lot of debt. Problem on that later, called the Great Depression in the 1930s. Finally, one of the big reactions in the 1920s, because the United States had been imperialistic prior to World War I, a lot of people blamed World War I and all the problems with it by the fact that we as the United States had spread our wings and had gone out into the world. And so the opposite reaction of the 1920s is isolationism. Let's go back in our cocoon and let's keep any kind of foreign influences outside of our country. One of the biggest examples of this is through the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, which we discussed in a prior presentation, I believe. This was all about the threat of communism spreading to the United States, and it's led by somebody by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer, who received a bomb in the mail, as well as several other bombs in the mail that were discovered throughout the country. And so he goes on this communist terror, where he tries to raid communists and seek out communist conspirators and all these kinds of things. Well, in the process of doing this, he ends up just deporting tons of people with little or no evidence and just kind of pointing the finger at communists all over the place, and just sort of shows the panic and the urgency that the United States had in the 1920s to become isolationist and to try to rid the United States of any kind of outside influences. Another great example of this and this isolation of this nativism that's coming back in is a huge court case with the two guys named Sacco and Vanzetti. They lived in Braintree, Massachusetts, and they were accused of murdering a factory paymaster where there was no evidence. And the only thing that they had kind of going against them is they were Italian immigrants and they were anarchists. And so they are put on trial without any evidence. They are convicted without any evidence, and they are executed. And it just gave more evidence to this rise of the idea of nativism coming back into society, and people looking for scapegoats for all their problems in immigrants and foreign influences. Okay. Finally, again, we see another iteration and another emergence of the Klan, and probably back and more popular than ever in the 1920s. And again, it's because of the desire to be isolationist. Now, many people, when we think of the Klan, we think about violence after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and particularly against Southern blacks. But the Ku Klux Klan was also very much anti-immigrant. And because of this, and because of what's going on in the 1920s, they become very, very popular. These nativist ideas as they enter back in. Now, the Klan was very, very out in the open in the 1920s and very, very popular. Membership reached an all-time high, and people were not really ashamed or anything about this because it had become such a powerful organization. So they would have like Klan picnics and bake sales and softball games and things like that. They don't wear the hoods everywhere, but obviously in this picture they do. But they were very much in the public eye. Excuse me, doing parades and things like that because they could. It had become that popular of an idea. And again, it's based in this anti-immigrant thing in this particular instance, and gained that popularity because of the isolationism of the 1920s. Finally, another response you see to this is something called immigration quotas, basically limiting the number of immigrants that could come into the United States. And that may not sound that radical to you, because there's a talk of immigration quotas nowadays. But what they did is they didn't institute these immigration quotas equally. They would curb immigration from certain countries or certain areas disproportionately to try to keep out what they would term as being undesirable immigrants out from different parts, particularly from Southern and Eastern European countries, from Asian countries, and other things like that. So they started to kind of cut off immigration into the United States to try to limit that influence from outside countries. So that's it. Lot of information in that, a lot of things going on in the 1920s, but again, people are grasping. They're looking for a way to just kind of make sense of it all, to try to get things back to normal. And these are where they pull for answers. We're going to talk about in the next couple lessons some other directions that they go to try to make sense of all of this. Again, they are just reaching. They're reaching because life doesn't make sense anymore, and they want stability again. And so some of these things provide some of that comfort. They provide some of that stability. They make them feel a little bit more secure. And so that's what they go to. Does that mean that they're right or they're okay? No, it doesn't. But it just means that they are in such a state that they are trying to find normalcy again. And so that's the big theme of the 1920s, is trying to get things right again. And you can find that they look for these answers in all different directions. And in many ways, they find satisfaction in some of these, although it doesn't produce really permanent results. That's the 1920s, politics, and some of the early solutions to recovering from World War I. You should have your note sheets filled in by now. Good luck. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you soon.